This past weekend, raiders and invaders came to Leonardtown. Maryland's commemoration of the War of 1812 has moved on, so it's time for Weekend Meetup to do a wrap-up on its segments regarding the war. Information for this week's broadcast comes from the Spark Notes website regarding the War of 1812. Prior to the war, which was declared by Congress on June 18, 1812, Britain and France were waging an economic war which also impacted the United States. France, under Napoleon, had control over the land of the continent, while Britain controlled the seas. France closed European ports so that they could not receive goods from Britain. Britain passed a law that required U.S. ships to land in a British port before proceeding to the continent. France logically responded by passing a law that said any U.S. ship that landed first in Britain and then came to the continent would be seized. In an effort to overcome this situation, Madison made a deal with the French. The British constantly needed sailors, and British warships would get them by stopping U.S. ships and taking their crews, a practice that's called impressment. This was one of the reasons for the start of the war. In North America, Britain controlled Canada. Between the United States and Canada, the Native Americans were being organized by Tecumseh as allies of the British. The British had told the Indians that if they won the war, they would let them have their own territory between Canada and the United States. The United States thought it could conquer Canada. Canada had hoped that it would win the war and could reclaim parts of the Northeast. The first battles of the war were fought in the Northeast, in Canada, and in the Great Lakes. There were no decisive victories, and from there the war moved to the Chesapeake and southern Maryland, hence our involvement last weekend. Neither side was able to have a decisive victory in the Chesapeake region as well. The British were able to sail up the Patuxent, then march overland, take Washington, burn the Capitol and the President's house. However, they were unsuccessful in taking Baltimore, an event that was to be the subject of Francis Scott Key's famous poem. With the war going nowhere, Britain still having to do something about France in Europe, and the United States economy being ruined, both sides began to negotiate a treaty. The negotiations were held in Ghent in Belgium. The treaty was signed on December 24, 1814. No territory was won or lost in the war. The British practice of taking sailors off ships wasn't mentioned in the treaty, and there was no mention of free trade. As the treaty was being negotiated, a British army of 7,500 soldiers was on the way to New Orleans. Waiting there was General Andrew Jackson and 4,500 militiamen. The Battle of New Orleans took place on January 8, 1815, after the treaty had been signed. The greatest American victory of the war and the last battle fought between Britain and the United States took place after the war had ended. The War of 1812, more than a placeholder between 1776 and 1861.